Today, we're cracking open a case file that's about 2,000 years old. We're going to look at the New Testament, but not as a book of faith. We're going to treat it like a historical document, a collection of clues that we can examine with the same critical eye we'd use for any other ancient text. So let's dive into the investigation.
And that leads us right to our central question. If we strip away the theology, what can history actually tell us about the New Testament? Is it a history book? Is it a faith story? Or is it something in between? That's really the mystery we're trying to solve here.
So to figure this out, historians have a pretty specific toolkit. The whole goal is to separate the historical Jesus from the theological Christ. It means you have to set aside the parts that are clearly about faith to see if you can find a core of what we can know from actual provable evidence. It's kind of like panning for gold, sifting through tradition to find those little nuggets of history.
So when we apply that really tough historical filter to the Gospels, what's left? You might be surprised. I mean, while most scholars accepted Jesus existed, very, very few specific events from his life passed the strictest historical tests.
In fact, it's kind of wild when you think about it. Despite all the pages and pages of stories in the Gospels, from the Nativity all the way to the miracles, critical historians have reached what they call almost universal assent on only just two events in Jesus' life.
And here they are. First, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And second, that he was crucified by order of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. That's it. Some scholars call this the minimal historical Jesus. It's the bedrock. So the big question is, out of everything, why these two events?
Well, the answer comes down to this really fascinating tool historians use. It's called the Criterion of Embarrassment. The logic behind it is simple but super powerful. If a detail in a story is awkward or problematic or just plain embarrassing for the people telling it, they probably didn't make it up, right? It's most likely in there because it was a well-known fact they just had to deal with.
Okay, so let's apply that to our two facts. Think about the baptism. For early Christians trying to show Jesus as the Son of God, having him be baptized by John suggested that John was spiritually superior. That's a really awkward detail. And crucifixion? That was a humiliating, brutal death reserved for criminals and enemies of Rome. That's not the heroic ending you'd invent for your Savior. The fact that these details are so counterproductive is exactly what makes them so believable to historians.
All right, so we've got two solid historical events. But what about the documents themselves? This is where our investigation gets way more complicated. See, one of the biggest problems for historians is that we don't have the original manuscript of any book in the New Testament. Not one. All we have are copies of copies of copies, all made by hand over hundreds of years. This broken chain of custody is a huge puzzle.
Just look at this on the screen. Does it say God is nowhere? Or does it say God is now here? This is a perfect example of one of the biggest headaches for ancient scribes. Early Greek manuscripts were written in what's called Scriptio Continua, just a long stream of capital letters with no spaces at all. You can see how easy it would be to make a mistake or misinterpret something.
And the challenges didn't stop there. On top of having no spaces, the scribes were dealing with text in all caps, no punctuation, no periods, no commas, and no paragraphs to break things up. And get this, a lot of the time they were copying from dictation, meaning one person read the text aloud while others wrote. I mean, just think how easy it would be to mishear a word. The result is thousands upon thousands of differences, or what scholars call textual variants, between all the manuscripts we have today.
Now, some of these variants are just minor spelling mistakes, but some of them are, well, they're much bigger than that. We're talking about entire stories that seem to have been intentionally added to the text later on. So now, our investigation is opening the case files on what some might even call textual forgery.
Okay, check this out. According to the oldest and most reliable manuscripts we have, this is how the Gospel of Mark originally ended. The women find the empty tomb, they're told Jesus has risen, and they bolt in terror, telling no one, the end. That's it. It's so abrupt and honestly pretty unsettling. And you can imagine for later Christians, it was deeply unsatisfying.
So it seems that later scribes just added a new ending. That sudden, fearful conclusion got replaced with 12 new, triumphant verses where Jesus appears to his followers and promises them miraculous powers. This new ending wasn't just happier, it also did a nice job of making Mark's story line up better with the other Gospels.
Now, for another huge case file, the story of the woman caught in adultery, where we get that famous line, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." The forensic evidence against this being original is pretty overwhelming. First, the story is completely missing from our earliest and best manuscripts. When it finally does pop up hundreds of years later, scribes stick it in different places, some even put it in the Gospel of Luke, and the language is a dead giveaway. The writing style and vocabulary are totally different from the rest of John's Gospel. It's a really powerful story, but all the evidence says it wasn't there at the beginning.
So, after looking at the events and looking at the texts themselves, what's the final verdict from our historical investigation? What can we say with any real confidence, and where does history just have to raise its hands and say, we can't know?
And this brings us to the most important distinction of all. History can absolutely verify that something profound and transformative happened after Jesus' death. His followers, people who were scared and hiding, had experiences that turned them into believers willing to die for their cause. That transformed belief, that's a historical fact. But the reason for that transformation, the claim that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, that's a theological claim. It's simply beyond what history can prove or disprove.
So we end up right back where we started, with a question. Knowing that these texts have a complex, very human history, that they were copied and edited and changed over time, that doesn't have to diminish them. In fact, it might invite us into a totally different way of reading them. So, how does knowing the history behind the words change how we engage with the words themselves? That's the question this investigation leaves us with.